This video has been sponsored by War Thunder. I've done numerous videos on the evolution of infantry squads, but none on tanks. That changes today. In this video, I'm going to cover the evolution of US Army Tank Company organization from World War I to the present day. I'll be talking about the structure of unreinforced tank companies in over a dozen snapshots spanning a century, the tanks in use, and stuff like ranks of personnel and supporting vehicles. Let's go back to the beginning, World War I. The original tank units came under a new independent tank corps that made its combat debut during the San Miguel offensive on September 12, 1918. This new corps had two types of tank battalion: the Light Tank Battalion, templated for the French Renault FT and later M1917 derivative, and the Heavy Tank Battalion, templated for the male variant of the British Mark V tank with the two 6-pounder or 57mm guns. Let's start with the light tanks. The actual TO&E, which follows closely the 1917 recommendation of one Captain George S. Patton, shows the American M1917 light tank, with either a 37mm M1916 cannon or 30 cal Marlin M1917 machine gun. In reality, the Americans fought with the Renault FT, which was armed with either a 37mm SA-18 cannon or 8mm Hotchkiss M1914 machine gun. Each tank was crewed by two soldiers, a commander templated as a sergeant, and a driver templated as a corporal. The commander was alone in the turret, so also had to fire and load their weapon. 2 cannon tanks and 3 machine gun tanks made the ideal platoon. This mix meant that cannons could deal with bunkers and entrenched positions, while the machine guns could deal with infantry, all while protected from small arms fire. One of the tanks would be commanded by a second lieutenant acting as platoon commander, while a platoon's 5th sergeant was mechanic. There were an additional 5 general duty privates in the platoon for a total of 15 soldiers. Companies were meant to have 3 of these platoons under a headquarters section, which itself was larger than all the platoons put together. This was a pretty hefty command and logistics element. Among other things, it included 9 light fighting tanks and 1 signal tank. One of the fighting tanks was the company commander's tank, while the other 8 were in reserve and could be used for training, and the signal tank was casemate and unarmed. As well, in one of 3 companies per light tank battalion, one of the reserve tanks would be used for the battalion commander. Other vehicles in the HQ included 18 3-ton trucks, 9 8 to 10 ton special trailers for moving the reserve tanks, 2 motorcycles with sidecars, and a 5-passenger motor car. In addition to the corporals driving the reserve tanks, the company was authorized 8 privates first class as tank drivers in reserve, and 15 privates for general duties. Heavy tank units were similarly structured tanks-wise, but with very different manning requirements. Each British Mark V tank was authorized 11 men, a tank commander ranking 2nd lieutenant, mechanic and tank driver ranking sergeant, 2 6-pounder gunners ranking corporal with private assistant gunners, and 4 machine gunners ranking private first class. Each tank had 2 spare machine guns in addition to the 4 on the tank. Platoons likewise had 5 of these tanks, in addition to a platoon commander ranking 1st lieutenant and a cook. It was worked out that 1 tank platoon would be attached to each assaulting infantry battalion in the first wave of an attack to lead them into the trenches, clear barbed wire obstacles, and destroy machine gun emplacements. Companies had 3 of these platoons, plus 1 tank for the company commander, 7 tanks in reserve, and a signal tank. The reserve tanks had a skeleton crew of a sergeant mechanic, corporal driver, and 2 private assistant gunners, while the commanders and signal sergeants' tanks were fully manned. Logistically, they only had 9 3-ton trucks instead of 18, and only 7 3-ton trailers. I'm guessing because the heavy tanks couldn't be trailered, but they had a 3rd motorcycle. After World War I, there was a mess of politics surrounding the tank that you'll have to watch a Chieftain video to fully grasp. The too long didn't read is in 1920, the Independent Tank Corps was disbanded, the infantry branch claimed ownership of the tank as a concept, and the establishment cavalrymen loved the horse. The cavalry did adopt light tanks on an experimental basis in the 1930s, but to get around the law, they called them combat cars. Some lower-level cavalrymen advocated for the creation of a separate tank branch, but this wouldn't actually come to pass until war had already engulfed Europe. I'll cut the interwar down the middle and talk about the 1930 series TO&Es, specifically the Light Tank Company of the Infantry Division. There were other kinds of tank units as well, but we got like 90 more years to go, so gotta keep it moving. The tank platoon at this time was still 5 tanks, and would be until the 1980s. These were nominally M1917s, with the same mix of 2 cannon and 3 machine gun tanks as previously. By this point, tank commanders ranked corporal, and drivers were privates or privates first class with a specialist 4th class rating. Platoons also had their 2nd lieutenant platoon commander, platoon sergeant, and 2 messengers. The company had 3 of these platoons and a headquarters platoon split into 3 sections: headquarters, maintenance, and replacement. Like during the war, the replacement section kept 4 cannon and 5 machine gun tanks in reserve, for a total of 24 per company. Their commanders were also corporals, but drivers were lower rated specialists 5th class. I'm not a 1920s truck expert, and these TO&Es are vague, so I don't want to visualize the wrong models, but the vehicles in the HQ platoon are typed on screen. Notably, this included 33 tank carriers, probably a Mac AC or something similar, enough to carry all tanks in the company, plus some cargo. Fast forward to World War II, and quite a lot has changed. The tank role has been pried from the infantry and cavalry chiefs' cold dead hands. Their offices were literally abolished. The Armored Force has been created as its own independent quasi-branch, and the US Army has invented a tank company design that would go on with only minor modification until the introduction of the Abrams in the 80s. As the progenitor to the main battle tank, I'll be focusing on the medium tank from now on, the real oomph to the new armored divisions. An oomph you can experience for free in War Thunder. War Thunder is a free-to-play game on PC, consoles, and mobile devices that puts you in command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations from the interwar to the modern day. Really, there'd never be a more fitting partnership for a video on a century of tanks. There's something for mill nerds of all kinds. There really isn't any other game that gives you such a wealth of choice in vehicles in all domains. War Thunder's artillery strikes might as well be coming from orbit as far as I'm concerned. Every vehicle is intricately detailed down to its individual components with their own damage model. You can see them take a hit in War Thunder's X-ray view. You'll be joining a worldwide community of over 70 million players battling it out in one of the most expansive and accessible vehicle combat games today. Click the link in my pinned comment or video description to play War Thunder for free. New PC or console players and those who haven't played in 6 months will receive a massive bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle Valor vehicle decoration, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account time. Available for a limited time only, so don't miss it. But back to World War II. By the time of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, the US Army operated 2 medium tanks, the M4 Sherman and the M3 Lee, the funny guy with the hull 75mm and turreted 37mm. By late 1942, the M3 Lee was already on the way out in favor of the Sherman. But the 1st Armored Division's 2nd Battalion, 13th Armored, did land in Algeria with M3 Lees as part of Operation Torch. Some Sherman units had to be re-equipped with Lees to replace heavy losses as well, such as the 751st Tank Battalion of the 1st Tank Group attached to the 34th and 9th Infantry Divisions. The National Guard 193rd Tank Battalion in the Pacific was also notable for using the M3 Lee during the amphibious assault on Macon Atoll in November of 1943. But the Sherman was still considered the top-of-the-line standard and was deployed at this time. With all that said though, I'm talking about the M3 Lee for 1942 because I want to. In 1942, the medium tank company consisted of a company headquarters and 3 tank platoons. The company HQ had 6 sections: Command, Tank, Communication Liaison and Recon, Maintenance, Admin and Supply, and Mess. The command section consisted of the company commander and others mounted in a half-track. In practice, the CO would also use one of the tanks in the tank section. The Jeep would carry the communications sergeant, who aside from repairing radios and such, would help guide the tank company into positions. The maintenance section was led by the maintenance officer, ancestor to the current executive officer. Organically, the section had a jeep and 2 half-tracks, but also used the other tank in the tank section for the maintenance officer, acting as a first-line replacement. Lastly, the admin, supply, and mess functioned as a single rear echelon under the first sergeant. At this time, the first sergeant was authorized a 37mm gun motor carriage, basically an AT gun on a Dodge 3/4 ton. This was undoubtedly for anti-tank defense and would later be replaced in this role by the bazooka carried with the rear echelon. I don't know how much it was actually used in tank companies. The rear esh also had 3 deuce-and-a-half trucks, 2 for equipment and 3 for mess. Each tank platoon, meanwhile, was equipped with 5 medium tanks, split into a platoon HQ and 2 sections of 2 tanks. By the Cold War, this evolved into the platoon leader in a heavy 3-tank section and platoon sergeant in a light 2-tank section, but for now, the doctrine was more like a modern infantry squad. Each Ali was crewed by 7 men initially. The commander, 37mm gunner and loader, 75mm gunner and loader, driver, and radio operator. Moving on to 1944, the M3 Ali was gone and the M4 Sherman was the universal standard medium tank. While in late 1944 there was a mix of 75mm and 76mm gun Shermans, during the invasion of Normandy, only 75mm gunned M4 and M4A1 Shermans were used in combat. The 76s didn't start showing up in the 2nd and 3rd Armored Division until July. Each Sherman was crewed by 5 tankers. The number 2, 3, and 5 tanks in the platoon were commanded by a sergeant. A corporal acted as the gunner, while a technician 5th grade equivalent to a corporal acted as driver, and privates acted as bow gunner and cannoneer, the formal name for loaders. Of these, only the drivers were specifically designated as technicians. Tanks number 1 and 4, meanwhile, were commanded by the platoon commander, ranking lieutenant, and the platoon sergeant, ranking staff sergeant. Their drivers were higher-ranking technicians 4th grade, equivalent to a sergeant, likely to allow for less micromanagement. The platoon would be split into the platoon HQ with the platoon commander's tank, 1st section with the sergeant tank commanders, and 2nd section under the platoon sergeant. Medium tank companies had 3 of these platoons and a company headquarters. It had its own 3 tanks. A command tank for the company commander in combat, manned by a spare tank commander on the march, a replacement tank commanded by the communications chief, and a Sherman equipped with a 105mm howitzer for direct fire support. The 105 Sherman could also be pulled in the assault gun platoon in the Battalion HQ company, which had 3 of its own. However, like the 76 Shermans that were sent to the UK at the same time as the 105s, they were not widely fielded until after D-Day. In the company, these tanks composed the headquarters section, which also had a jeep for the company commander on the march, spare tank commander in combat, bugler as a driver, and liaison agent. There was also a maintenance section and an administration section. Maintenance had a half-track for the motor transport officer, M32 tank recovery vehicle, and a jeep for the motor sergeant. This was actually the first dedicated recovery vehicle for tank companies. Administration had a deuce-and-a-half with trailer for the first sergeant, clerks, mess personnel, and 6 basic duty privates, basically soldiers who have not qualified into an MOS yet. They were extra fat programmed into American organizations to provide live-in replacements if the company took casualties, and until they were needed, familiarized themselves with their unit and performed basic tasks such as guard duty and aiding the mess team. During the war, tank battalions had 3 medium tank companies, 1 light tank company, an HQ and HQ company, and a service company. Each infantry division would generally get a separate tank battalion attached to it, while regular light armored divisions had 3 of their own tank battalions, and the heavy armored divisions with a regimental structure had 6. The latter included the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions and the 1st Armored Division until 1944. By the Korean War, the medium tank company was very similar with some differences. For instance, the M47 Patton, M46 Patton, M26 Pershing, and 76mm gun Sherman were all used in this role during the war. As well, the Army went through an enlisted rank restructure in the late 1940s, very strange by modern standards. I'd call it the worst rank structure we've ever had, both aesthetically and functionally. It's on screen now for you to pause if you want. Tank platoons still had 5 tanks. For infantry regiment tank companies, these would have been Shermans with a 76mm long gun, while the infantry division's tank battalion fielded Pershings and Pattons as well. Sergeants first class commanded tanks 2, 3, and 5. The platoon sergeant, ranking master sergeant, the highest NCO rank equivalent to a regimental sergeant major, commanded tank 4, and the platoon leader commanded tank 1. Gunners and drivers were sergeants, with the rank insignia more like today's staff sergeant. Bow gunners were corporals, and cannoneers were privates first class. Everyone was issued a pistol, while the cannoneers also had a submachine gun and the bow gunners had a carbine. The platoon HQ in infantry division tank platoons also had a jeep. This had its own driver and was to be used by the platoon leader for liaison, recon, emergency resupply, and evacuation. In combat or in rough terrain, it would either accompany the tank company HQ or the infantry unit the tank platoon was attached to. Given this type of platoon would be attached to an infantry battalion, there'd be more of a need for decentralized liaison. Tank companies in infantry divisions had 4 tank platoons, and Korea was very much an infantry division war, but infantry division tank battalions had 3 tank companies. By contrast, armored division tank battalions had 4 companies of 3 platoons. 4 platoons allows a company to attach tanks to more infantry units without an unnecessary company HQ, while 4 companies allows task forces to create equal 2-to-2 infantry tank teams. The company HQ was similar to World War II, although with just 2 tanks and a jeep in the HQ section, the theoretical addition of an absolutely huge M44 armored utility vehicle to replace the half-track in the maintenance section, and a second deuce-and-a-half in the admin section. 6 personnel in the admin section were filler personnel, the new name for basic duty privates. Interestingly, around December of 1949, the Army added a warrant officer to act as a unit administration chief for companies and infantry regiments, basically filling the first sergeant's traditional role. This was a short-lived position gotten rid of by the mid-1950s, and was probably somewhat influenced by the mess they made with the enlisted rank system and NCO careers. With the introduction of the M48 Patton, crews were reduced from 5 to 4. By 1957, units that were converted to the M48 Patton would have a tank commander, gunner, tank driver, and loader, no longer the cannoneer name. It was during this period that the Army introduced its specialist ranks, so the gunners and drivers in tanks 2, 3, and 5 would be specialist 2s, while loaders would be specialist 3s. This was before the introduction of the modern pay grade system in 1959, so Specialist 2s were equivalent to sergeants, and Specialist 3s to corporals. The gunners in the platoon leader and platoon sergeant tanks ranked sergeant, and were also designated as assistant tank commanders, likely to reduce micromanagement. In the early days of the M48, it was specifically noted on reference data that units with a new tank were still authorized 5 crew members. In that case, the bow gunners would act as tank crew replacements, although post-Korea is when the Army really started towards minimum viable units without any internal replacements to keep them functioning with losses, so that note was quickly removed. But they did add the option to reinforce a tank company with a 12-man security section in an APC under the company HQ. These seem to have been extra junior tank crewmen, ranking private mostly, a functional fat replacement for the old basic duty privates. The theoretical M44 armored utility vehicle in the maintenance section was also replaced by an actually in-service M75 or newer M59 APC, while the M32 armored recovery vehicle was replaced by the M74 to cope with the larger Patton tank entering service. The first sergeant was also given his own jeep, but otherwise the company was similar. Pentomic was replaced by the road reorganization in 1962 though, and the more contemporary rank structure went into effect in 1959. The new M60 Patton with its 105mm gun was introduced in 1959 as well, and it was the first American tank designated as a main battle tank as opposed to a medium tank. The M103 heavy tank was retired in favor of the M60, and they stopped calling light tanks and recon units light tanks, so the medium tank was the only tank type left standing. The 90mm gunned M48 Pattons did remain in the 1960s though, largely because of the start of the Vietnam War and an unwillingness to follow through on an upgunning program for the National Guard until the mid-1970s. By 1962, platoons were still 5 tanks. Platoon leaders were still lieutenants, but platoon sergeants were now sergeants first class. Their assistant tank commander gunners were still sergeants, but with a more normal 3-stripe insignia. The 2, 3, and 5 tank commanders were now staff sergeants, a rank introduced after being gone for over a decade. Their gunners and drivers were specialist 5s, equivalent to sergeants in the new structure, and their loaders were privates first class, still lacking the rocker on their insignia during this period. At the company HQ, the admin section was combined with the HQ section, and company mess teams were consolidated in the Battalion HQ company. The tank company HQ consisted of 2 Pattons, 2 Jeeps, and a deuce-and-a-half truck. The maintenance section was an armored personnel carrier, by then an M113 if fully modernized, a tank recovery vehicle, ideally the new M88, 3/4-ton truck, and a Jeep. Added to the company was also a small ground surveillance section with an APC and a PPS-4 radar, although this was taken out by Vietnam. The security section became an optional augmentation when authorized by the Department of the Army, but stayed on the books through the 1960s and 70s. Jumping forward to the 1970s and the H-Series TO&Es, the M48 Patton had been withdrawn from regular Army units. On the active side, it beat uniformly the M60 Patton with a 105mm gun. However, the M60A2 Starship with a 152mm gun launcher for firing shillelagh missiles and heat was also introduced with the first unit equipped in 1975. Tank platoons were basically unchanged from 1962 except for equipment. Under the first TO&E variation, all tanks would be armed with a 105mm gunned M60A1 Patton. However, the second variation took into account the introduction of the 152mm M60A2, which started to be issued that year. In that TO&E, number 3 and 5 tanks would be the 152mm gunned M60A2. In Change 1 of the H-Series TO&Es reflected in 1977 training documents, they moved to having entire companies and battalions equipped with the Starship, and that's how they were actually fielded. The Shillelagh Tank Company was almost identical to the 105mm gun tank company, except for the tanks and a different mix of mechanics. Significantly though, one of the company's platoon sergeants would also be the company master gunner. The master gunner was a new position focused on helping commanders conduct gunnery training and supervise turret maintenance. The position was basically a response to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where the US Army took away that outshooting a larger enemy would be of the utmost importance for future tank battles. The first Master Gunner pilot program was conducted in 1975 and was initially not its own separate position. In the 1980s is when the US Army started cooking with gas. With the introduction of the M1 Abrams and the Division 86 Army of Excellence reforms, tank companies underwent their biggest reorganization since World War II. Aside from the Abrams being a major upgrade from the Patton, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 led to other downstream effects on the tank company organization. I've already mentioned the master gunner role, but the Army was also testing differences in tank platoon composition, particularly with a 1976 division restructuring study under William Dupuis Tradoc. They investigated decreasing the size of the platoon from 5 to 3 tanks. The rationale was to improve span of control, speed up decision-making on the battlefield, and allow for more battalions with fewer tanks. Some testing done on the 3-tank platoon did net positive results, but they weren't statistically significant, had shaky methodologies, and might have actually just proven that trained tank crews are better than untrained tank crews. Who knew? Rather, the initial Division 86 organization issued in 1980 set the stage for the modern American Armor Company. New Abrams platoons were reduced from 5 to 4 tanks. 3 tanks was believed to be the minimum necessary to be combat effective, so if a 3-tank platoon took 1 loss, that was already pretty bad. The Abrams also had some drivetrain issues early on, so Dupuis Tradoc's successor General Don Starry pushed for a 4-tank platoon instead, and that's what it's been ever since. As with so many things, such a foundational aspect of the Army was actually birthed in the 80s and not the beginning of the universe. This TO&E was early enough that the tank was still listed as the XM1 with a 105mm gun. As well, it was at this point that the tank company maintenance teams were centralized under the Battalion Headquarters Company for attachment to the tank companies. Today it's the same but with forward support companies. This was basically the start of the doctrinal fighting XO. While the executive officer had traditionally been in charge of the maintenance element, the lack of an organic one freed them up to take command of a tank. Interestingly, under Division 86, they were just putting motorcycles in places, so the tank company was given 2 dirt bikes for messengers. However, no additional messengers were authorized. Otherwise, things were pretty similar. 2 jeeps, although without trailers now, which carried the CO and XO out of combat, or their 2 spare tank commanders, the first sergeant and a chemical NCO. A deuce and a half carried the supply sergeant and armorer, and the old communications chief was removed. This structure was updated by the mid-1980s with the Army of Excellence updates to Division 86, and that's when the tank company reached its peak form. Tank platoons remained 4 tanks, although from late 1986, units started fielding the new M1A1 Abrams with the 120mm smoothbore gun. By Desert Storm, most units with some exceptions were on the M1A1. A key exception was the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, which still had M1IPs through the 1990s. The commanders ranked lieutenant, sergeant first class, and 2 staff sergeants. While the Div 86 org had a mix of ranks for gunners, loaders, and drivers, AOE fixed the gunners as sergeants for all tanks. At the company level, those extra motorcycles were gotten rid of. As the Humvee was introduced in 1985, the 2 old M61A2 Jeeps were replaced with 2 M998 Humvees. At the time, these carried the chemical NCO and the Master Gunner. The Master Gunner, ranking Staff Sergeant, was made a permanent role, becoming one of the spare tank commanders in the company HQ. It seems that the original dual role of Platoon Sergeant and Master Gunner discouraged Master Gunner candidates, which contributed to the later change. And finally, the First Sergeant was given an M113 APC. Like I said, the tank company has mostly remained unchanged since AOE, but there have been some minor ones. Let's fast forward to 2005, when the Army was undergoing its Modular Force reform that created the Brigade Combat Team Force. First big thing, they replaced the tank company name with Armor Company. Although in very Army fashion, tank companies and the armored cavalry regiments remained as tank companies officially, as they were on a different series of TO&Es. By this point, the M1A2 Abrams was the ideal standard tank, although some variants of the M1A1 continued to be used. The First Sergeant's APC was the M113A3 with the reliability improvements for selected equipment or RISE upgrades. The 2.5-ton 4x4 LMTV began replacing the old M35 2.5s in the 90s, and was what was authorized to tow the 400-gallon water trailer during the late Army of Excellence and Force 21 era. However, from the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s, they were prescribed a 5-ton MTV, probably so they could tow the future Camel 900-gallon water tank, which was a modernization goal to replace the M149 Water Buffalo. After the larger Camel was actually fielded though, the Army walked it back and said it only partially replaced the 400-gallon trailers and field feeding sections specifically, so this is one of those cases of preemptive modernization in TO&Es that doesn't stick. Just to give you a sense of completion, let's take you through the Army 2020 Armor Company, first handed down in 2016. Each platoon consisted of 4 120mm gunned M1A2 SEP V2 or M1A1 SA main battle tanks. The platoon leader led Alpha Section with 2 tanks, and the platoon sergeant led Bravo Section. Their wingman tanks were commanded by a staff sergeant. All gunners were MTO'd as sergeants, drivers as specialists, and loaders as privates first class. Gunners were also doctrinally assistant tank commanders. At the company level, the company headquarters consisted of 2 Abrams tanks, 2 up-armored M1165 Humvees, 1 for the Master Gunner and 1 for a Ford Signal Support NCO, an M11A3 Rise for the First Sergeant and Carrier Driver, and a 2.5-ton LMTV truck with the LTAS armored cab, and a 400-gallon water trailer for the Supply NCO and Specialist. If we were to bring this to the full modernized standard, you'd replace the Humvees with the M1280A1 4-seat JLTV and replace the M113 with the Bradley-based M1283 AMPV for the First Sergeant. As of 2025, certain units of the 1st Cavalry, 1st Armored, 3rd Infantry, and 34th Infantry Divisions at least have received JLTVs. Meanwhile, the 3rd Infantry Division's 1st and 2nd Armored Brigade combat teams were the first units equipped with the AMPV back in 2023 and 24 respectively, so a minority, but they're getting there. It's also worth noting that they intend to start fielding the FMTV-A2s this year, certainly one of the trucks of all time. So we've gone through 100 years of American Tank Company organization, from 5 tank platoons since the tank was invented to 4 with the introduction of the Abrams. From decadent amounts of spare internal replacement personnel and even spare tanks, to basically the bare minimum personnel to keep the company functioning. From tanks mostly under the infantry branch to their own separate branch that consumed the cavalry. And of course, from 2-man French boxes to one of the most prolific main battle tanks in existence. Things don't stay the same forever. Don't forget that in War Thunder, you can play as every tank in this video from the World War II segment onward for free on anywhere humans play games. PC, PlayStation, Xbox, mobile, you know how it is. Clicking my link down below will give any new player or anyone who hasn't played in 6 months a massive bonus pack including premium vehicles, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time. It's available for a limited time only, so don't miss out. And as always, thanks to my patrons and channel members for being so patient as I put this video together. If you like me being able to spend a month looking at TO&Es over a century, thank those guys. I'll see you in the next one.